This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Simone Sweeney. I'm an executive and leadership coach following a 25-year career leading high-performing teams in companies like Apple and the Lego Group. In this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to experts, coaches, and thought leaders as we make the case for why the future of great leadership is human. Discover how coaches are working to bring about a seismic change in how we define an incredible leader. We'll also consider the role of people versus technology and discuss why it's more important than ever to harness skills like self-awareness, communication, and gratitude, amongst others. In this series, our aim is to explore the very human capabilities and behaviors that will inspire a revolution in leadership and change the face of business. So on today's episode of The Future of Leadership is Human, I am rather sensationally exploring the theme of what happens when leadership goes bad. We're going to be exploring the antithesis of human-centered leadership and talking about things like toxicity, psychological safety, and general bad behavior, and what, as leaders, we should be watching out for and what we can do when it strikes. And I'm delighted to welcome Peter Greedy to the podcast today. So Peter, big welcome to you. Tell us a little bit about your background and the work you do.
Thanks, Simone. Lovely to be with you. My introduction to this area is, you used the word sensational, perhaps. So my background is, I started life, I was raised in a vicarage. My dad's a vicar. And at the age of 19, when I left home to go to university, I was recruited into a religious cult. And that's kind of my experience of culture, which I'm sure we'll come on to a bit later. I was in that organization for 15 years and realized I'd been in a cult about 10 years after I left. So while I was in it, had no idea. And then we left in 1998, which probably ages me a bit. But since then, I've kind of done a lot of work looking at what it means to be in a cult. I was a junior leader in that cult myself, so I was prone to some of these toxic behaviors that we'll talk about. But parallel to that, I've worked in healthcare. Just so everyone knows, I'm an optometrist, and I've been in primary healthcare just coming up for 40 years since I started my university degree. And then when COVID came along, I didn't have any work. And that's when I started my coaching journey, to bring it back to my connection with the Association for Coaching. So I'm a foundation coach with the Association for Coaching, and I really specialize in what I call personal development, team development, and leadership development. And I'm Belbin Team Roles accredited practitioner as well. So that kind of gives a feel for my area. One last thing to add, perhaps, in terms of my experience of toxic culture is not just with the cult. I did work for an American corporation for 12 years and certainly had some key learnings from being in corporate life over that period of 12 years. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of my background.
It's a fascinating background, and I think highly relevant to the topic of human-centered leadership, seeing, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, as the case may be. So delighted that you could join me today. And I think to build on the theme and to kind of take your impression, what does it mean to be a leader to you?
Sure. So for me, leadership is all about behaviors, and coming from a place of those behaviors coming from your values. I believe values are perhaps the strongest indicator of someone's identity as a person. And for me, leadership is very much the focus on who you are rather than perhaps what you do. I tend to think of management as the doing bit, whereas I think of leadership more as the how you do what you do. I believe everyone is a leader in some way, whatever you're doing, if you choose to exhibit those behaviors. But yeah, that's the essence for me of what leadership is about.
It's fantastic how you're relating that to values. And happily, that's a common theme that we are exploring in quite a few of the episodes, is that connection or even that grounding for human-centered leaders in their values and beliefs, and relating that to the, maybe the organizational setting they work in. You spoke about behavior there, and that the difference between management and leadership is often the approach that you take. And there are a lot of behaviors out there that people will recognize and hopefully, be better able to recognize as a result of this series that kind of are the hallmarks of the human-centric leader. Things like self-awareness, empathy, compassion, gratitude, and trust as a kind of vital foundation to that. And it would be great for us to explore that concept of psychological safety, which connects so strongly to so many of those behaviors. But first, maybe what do we mean by psychological safety? It might not be a term that everyone's familiar with.
Yeah, so psychological safety for me is, I thought about this, and I would say if I was going to try and sum it up in a brief sentence, it's that place where you belong and are unconditionally accepted for who you are and where there is no judgment. And for me, that's those three aspects. Belonging is a very important thing to me, belonging as opposed to fitting in. We might want to unpack what's the difference between those at some point. But the whole aspect of being accepted for who you are rather than being accepted for how you change yourself to fit in, hence the fitting in. And that lack of judgment really is unconditional acceptance and no judgment. And to bring that back to something you said, of course, that's absolutely based on the foundation of trust and establishing trust in any relationship.
I think that's a fantastic definition of psychological safety. Psychological safety is an environment and is a place, both physical, but even more metaphysical.
Absolutely.
Of trust, of safety, of tolerance, of acceptance. And I'm intrigued by the concept of belonging versus fitting in. And particularly what it sparks in me is so often politics in a workplace result from someone trying to fit in or manage up, or demonstrate their skills because that's the perception of how you get ahead in a lot of businesses. So tell me a little bit more about what you mean by the belonging versus fitting in, because I think that's a really important concept.
Yeah, and this is stuff I'd say if I was going to credit someone, I think the work of Brené Brown is fantastic on this whole area. Brené's a social research scientist and has done some fantastic work and written many books that I'd highly recommend to anyone listening here. So belonging, well, let me start with fitting in, because actually I think a lot of people fit in without realizing. And I think particularly, yes, it's very much the case in work, but it's sometimes harder to recognize. I think perhaps the most common place people fit in is in social media. And the toxicity of social media, where you have this projection that people put out there of who they are, is trying to create an image that fits in with what society is saying we should be, whether that's how we speak, how we dress, how we look, how we behave, all those factors. When we change those things to be accepted by another group, that's us fitting in. Whereas the belonging aspect is us showing up as we truly are and being loved and accepted for who we truly are, rather than people putting conditions on us to say, well, if you want to be part of this group, you've got to do this, this, and this things, or you've got to behave this way, or you've got to dress this certain way, or you've got to use this product or whatever. It's where we can be truly our truest self with whatever color, sexual preference, orientation, life experience, etc., whoever we are as the individual, that we are unconditionally accepted for being who we are. And that to me really is how I'd kind of describe it.
The perspective of the difference within a team, but the ability to embrace the uniqueness of each individual. It makes me think of the metaphor of a tapestry. Every thread, every color, every piece of texture brought out by an individual's experience, background, beliefs, values, expertise. That's what makes teams so varied and successful, that diversity of experience, diversity of thought. So to truly get the best from that group, that feeling of belonging that nurturing and creation of a place of psychological safety then seems to be vital. So it's probably asking the obvious, but is psychological safety necessary for a happy and successful team?
Here's the thing. When I think about that, is it necessary? I would say one of the challenges we have, in some respects, we've become so almost immune, resilient, calloused to certain work environments that actually, I don't know whether this is controversial, I believe you can be successful and, in air quotes, happy in a fairly toxic / psychologically unsafe environment. However, I do not believe that's a healthy environment. And without doubt, however good it is, it would always be much better if you have the absence of that toxicity and you have that safety of what we call psychological safety in the environment. Without doubt, those teams are going to perform better. But it is sad that we've become accustomed or immune, as I say, to working in those environments that aren't that healthy. And we're not that happy, but we still plod on because of fear, actually, is probably the word to use there. We're fearful of losing our job. We're fearful of being rejected. We're fearful of not being part of the in crowd. We're fearful. And so, yeah, teams can perform reasonably well, but they will always perform much better when you're addressing those issues of making sure it is psychologically safe and you're eliminating toxicity where you can.
I really appreciate your candid and pragmatic response there, Peter, because I can certainly relate to what you're saying. I have absolutely existed and indeed thrived in certain situations where there was very little or no psychological safety or, toxic behavior. And in others, I haven't. And it's, I think, a human-centric note to ourselves is that usually there's a tipping point, and where there is a difficult environment or a challenging environment or toxic behavior or kind of an erosion of trust, it can be very wearing on an individual and on the team dynamics and on the leader itself if that's not being cultivated at that level. So usually there's a point where things start to fall apart and to break a little bit. And we'll explore that, I think, later in this conversation. But your perspective of, yes, it's possible, but it's something certainly to reflect and acknowledge, I think, is an important thing to take away. And often in my personal experience, but in working with leaders and clients across multiple industries, it often takes a good bit of reflection and a change of perspective or some kind of provocation or challenge for that perspective to shift, to recognize that the environment that you're in. And that makes me curious as what happens or how do we recognize when there's very little psychological safety? Let's start with how do we recognize that we might be working in an environment, or our clients, for those of us who are coaches listening today, how can you recognize that an environment is toxic or there's poor psychological safety?
Sure. So I think there are behaviors that you can look at, but there are also signs and symptoms, if you like, where you can be aware of. So, I genuinely think if you're coming into an environment as an outsider, you'll see various things that individuals in the team, their well-being is suffering, but also, simple signs like people are less committed. They might be showing up late. They might be giving excuses. They might be disengaged with their work. In more extreme levels, people start taking credit for other people's work, or they start gaslighting people. So there's lots of signs, if you like, that toxicity is at play. Of course, there's the much more subtle behaviors, which we can chat about a bit. But I think definitely you will look at people. I love looking at people's eyes. I use this phrase, has the light gone out? And you can just tell if people are engaged or disengaged. And then it's, how do you unpack that? We can talk about the role of the coach, in fact, in that sometimes. The coach is there to kind of unpack that and start to find what's the root cause of some of those signs that we can see just through chatting to people.
Absolutely. And maybe add a few others there. I mean, this is the domain of stress and then moving into burnout, but also practically more days off sick, more requests for leave, requests maybe for flexible working might be a sign that something's kind of coming up there, a change of scenario. And hopefully that there is at least enough of the shreds of a positive, trusting relationship, even when things are more strained, that there is an open communication and feedback is being shared. So either feedback on the individual or the team that performance has dropped, or that there's concerns about their well-being, or the leader or colleagues noticing and flagging something too. That kind of, while we talk about human-centric leadership, there's also that kind of connection to colleagues and
Sure.
keeping an eye on well-being too, maybe to build on what you were saying there.
If I may just add one point, one of the problems and one of the challenges in all of that, so a lot of those things that we talked about, people being late, people asking for more time off, and those sorts of indicators, one of the challenges is there are a bunch of other things that could be causing those same signs of stress, burnout, of coming in late. They might have problems at home. They might be going through tricky relationship. They might have somebody who's ill at home, or they might be struggling financially for whatever reasons. People can get themselves into all sorts of problems. And so part of the challenge in all of that is helping to look for what is the root cause, because we don't want to jump to conclusions and assume, it's this or that, when actually we might be getting that wrong. As a leader, looking after a team, it's really important to just be looking out for what, in medical terms, we call it differential diagnosis. Okay. It's what's going on.
And that is a critical point to be making, because in a situation or in a relationship where there's, toxicity, where there's little trust, that kind of freedom of connection, the conversation, the open sharing, that demonstration of vulnerability will be less anyway, because someone's pulled back. So
absolutely,
that makes is almost a great call out to leaders to work extra hard with the compassion, the empathy, the noticing, and really seeing the person in front of them and trying to understand, and hopefully building up the relationship and moving past the difficult to get there. And so I think those are great signs for us to consider as little flags or big flags. And of course, the biggest flag of all, neither of us mentioned, which is quitting. People just up and having
Yes.
had enough. So obviously that's one too. But the signs may be subtle or they might be more overt. But what does it mean beyond those signs we talked about and people maybe withdrawing from work or performance suffering? What happens to a team or an organization when there is little psychological safety or there's some considerable bad behavior? What happens over time?
Well, a lot. That's part of the challenge, isn't it? So we'll quickly slip into areas of blame, shame, ridicule. Relationships get stretched, particularly, I think, between team members. And again, the team itself, the team is always the sum of the individual parts, right? So if all your individuals are suffering and getting stressed, taking more time off, sick days, etc., usually that puts a burden on the other team members, because actually then people who are already perhaps at their max are then being asked by toxic leadership to pick up the extra slack from the people that aren't there or that aren't performing. And that relationship gets even more stretched within the teams. And eventually, if it gets really bad, that team is just going to implode. Probably they'll miss deadlines, their performance will suffer, and the company suffers, customers suffer, everyone suffers. And you can see that in the language of people, of communications, whether that's verbal or in emails and texts, etc. So I think there's so much that can happen that it's such a tough one once that trust starts to be eroded. And looking at what are the behaviors, we can talk a bit specifically about the behaviors of what makes great behavior from a leadership and what is the toxic antithesis to that. Because I think then if you think about what's the opposite, it starts to actually say, oh, okay, so now I can identify some of those things.
Great. Let's look at that, because I think it's important for people to be able to label it. And I also always wonder if there are shades of gray. So while you're taking us through, because I have this kind of mental catch-all category in my mind of bad behavior, and I've had it in my head for many years, having experienced it, maybe sometimes having done it myself as a leader, seen it in teams and different organizations and in the people that I'm coaching. But there's a huge range of bad behavior here. It's everything from possibly neglect, simply a leader just ignores their people, just doesn't engage, never shares, isn't vulnerable, there's no connection, to microaggression, to subversion, to inappropriate remarks, to harassment, to bullying. There's so much. Now, the good news is there's a lot of really positive leadership behavior. So it would be fantastic for us to explore, again, the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So when we say, what's a good behavior, what's a bad behavior, what springs to mind for you?
Sure. So you've teed me up very nicely there, Simone, because this is an area I've worked on, I've actually written on. Within my profession, I write CPD workshops and stuff for people, and it's an area of passion. So I personally developed something I call the Leadership A-list. So let me talk about that because it's something passionate, if I may. So what the work's done is I've got a list of 10 behaviors that all start with A. I love alliteration. My values are alliterated in that my 3 core values are connection, contribution, and contentment. Okay. And I've got my A list of what are the great behaviors. So what I've done there is the list is grouped into 5 areas of values: emotional intelligence, self-management, control, and belonging. So if we just take values, for example, my 2 A-list behaviors there are authenticity and alignment. For me, authenticity is all about your personal values, who you are. Dig into what values mean to you and what are your core values. That's a whole exercise in and of itself that you to go through in terms of most psychologists and social scientists would say that your core values are within you from roughly fully developed by about the ages of 7 or 8, really, really young. And when you do that exercise, it's quite difficult. And it's personally taken me it's an ever evolving thing. It's still evolving, but took me a good few years to kind of come up with those 3 core values that for me represent everything about me and determine every decision I make of connection, contribution, and contentment. And I've got sub-values underneath those that help to guide and help me be clear on those. Alignment for this work in leadership, to me, is also absolutely values orientated, but are your personal values aligned with the values of the company, the corporation, the business that you work for, and particularly sometimes at a lower level, not just the big corporation and the business, but the person leading you as well. What's the values of that leader? So whether I'm the leader and I have to think about my values and then aligning them with the company, but if I'm being led by someone else, I want to kind of get a sense for what are the values of the person that's leading me. So that's a sample of just the first 2 of the A list. But in that, then I think about what's the antithesis of those 2. And to your point, it is kind of a spectrum. It's absolutely not binary. You're this or you're that. So for me, the antithesis, for example, of authenticity is being fake. And the antithesis for me of alignment in terms of are we aligned is the leader that is self-serving. And like you said, there's all sorts of different levels at which those things are expressed, both on the good side and also on the bad side. So if we think, is someone truly authentic or is someone being a bit fake? It's quite interesting. I listened to a podcast just yesterday. This pops into my mind. And the person was asked, what's the worst leadership advice you've ever got? And the reply was, be yourself. Now, I struggled with that. And I thought, hang on a minute. That really challenged my thinking around authenticity. I was listening to this with my wife, and it's really helpful to get then someone's other perspective, because I think a lot of us would think being my true self is absolutely key. And there is some people who are a bit fed up of the word authenticity, but I still think it's a great thing to use. My wife then said, well, actually, for me, it's a real challenge to be myself. And I need to sometimes be called on because she is somebody who worries constantly about what other people think. She's a people pleaser and so will often not be herself to her detriment. And my tendency is to actually be the opposite. I can be too much myself. So I immediately thought that's a bit strange because I do want to be myself. Although, again, with a caveat, and this is kind of showing these shades of gray, even within authenticity. So I have to be aware when I'm doing a one-to-one consultation in a healthcare clinic, perhaps I need to be, in air quotes, professional. So there's certain things that if I'm chatting to a friend, I might share, disclose. But if I'm in a professional relationship, there's certain things that would be less appropriate for me to. So I'm then suddenly aware that I'm behaving one way in this context, and I'm behaving a slightly different way in a different context. So, and the point actually the person was making is that context was so important in the situation. And hearing then my wife's perspective, who's saying, well, actually, sometimes I need to be encouraged to be more myself rather than to worry about her issue, is coming back to what we talked about earlier, which is her worry is fitting in, because she's worried if she doesn't fit in and behave in a way she's fitted in, her self-confidence is poor. So in terms of just as an example of the grey scale, if you like, the shades of grey that you mentioned, it can be really challenging. And I think, again, coming back to what's the role of coaching in that particular example, it's really helping people to say, okay, first off, get really clear on your values. So know yourself, be who you are. Don't be apologetic for who you are, but then realize that contextually, it's really important to think, how is my behavior affecting the situation within which I am? Be that as someone being led or someone who's a leader, or actually in the peer-to-peer. So managing upwards, managing downwards, or managing sideways, looking at all those relationships. So the dynamics there are really complicated. Does that make sense to you?
It does, because often in the workplace, there is a perception which might be, as you said, as a result of an individual's values and experience and upbringing, or might be managed by the culture and the behavior norms in the organization that leads someone to act in a particular way and represent themselves in a different fashion. And one of the things we've explored a little bit in the series is emotional intelligence and the role of self-regulation in the workplace, and how sometimes, particularly in periods of change or stress, or when, there is a very particular business agenda, it can become easy to be less good at managing your emotions for a leader, for anyone, but for leaders that has a bigger influence. And so to look towards the examples, the scenario you were just speaking to there, it is very important for us to be mindful that our behavioral state, how we're maybe showing up, just to speak to it more plainly, is often influenced by the situation at hand, the environment you're in, and the people you're relating to. And that then leads me towards the question of culture. And you've pointed out previously that the root of culture is cult. How is culture important? How should we be thinking of it in terms of the workplace?
Yeah, so having been in a cult and having kind of unpacked that area and the influence, what's really interesting is there are times when cult-like behavior or culture is of benefit, and there are times when cult-like behavior are toxic. And I think understanding those differences is really important. So, for example, I would suggest perhaps the best example of an area where cult-like behavior is important is in the military, in the armed forces. So it's an organization that has a very clear goal, direction. People all dress the same. They generally behave the same. They have the same kind of schedule and timetable. They have a very organized setup. And if you think about it, in fact, a lot of those are very cult-like tendencies. There's a lot of control. And I think control is one of the key things of any cult. So a cult is going to try to control you, be that your time, be that your thinking, be that your behavior. And so I think when it comes to culture in corporations, you'll see, well, actually not just in corporations, you see cult-like tendencies all over the place. So you can see it in sport, for example. The followers of Manchester United, as an example, are kind of a cult, right? You can see it in celebrity status, be that people who follow movie stars, people who follow pop stars, singers, performers, etc.
Politicians
Politicians as well, for sure. I'd rather stay away from the politics.
Yeah, we'll stay away from politics, absolutely. That's often a place where people will maybe identify difficult behavior.
Correct. And the area where you get to, where you have less grey scale, actually, having talked about some grey scales. Cults tend to be very binary in their thinking. Right, wrong, good, bad, God, devil, etc. And that's what I was indoctrinated in when I was in a cult myself. It's that we had it all figured out. Everyone else didn't. And if anything bad happened, that was because we were doing good and the world was against us, or the devil was against us, or whatever. And I think what's interesting is when you see certain organizations. So another feature of cults is you often have a charismatic leader. We can think of some amazing role models, some who've been amazingly good and amazingly bad, right? In corporations. Again, we'll stay away from politics on purpose, but you can think of people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Richard Branson. Lots and lots of very famous big names in corporate cultures. And they get scrutinized a lot, unpacked, and people have written biographies about them, etc. And there's movies about some of them, And it's interesting to see the influence that a very charismatic, very driven, very sometimes authoritarian type character can have. And quite often that's when things have to be done a particular way. Again, it's coming back to control. It's like, what sort of sense of control? And for me, the opposite of that is what you said earlier. And I totally agree. It's that diversity where you have, in fact, all thinking aloud. Okay. One of the things a cult does for you is it takes away your ability to think critically. And critical thinking for me is an absolute essential for all individuals to not just absorb and do what you're told. So I think how you do that and how you allow for opposite opinions, different opinions, healthy conversation, confrontation, or healthy debate, as I would call it. Coming back to the work of Patrick Lencioni, and his 5 dysfunctions of a team. After trust, his next one is confrontation. And if you think about teams, I totally resonate with that and agree with the need to have a forum, again, a psychologically safe forum where you can have healthy confrontation, where people are allowed to express their views that might be quite different to what perhaps corporate culture says. We don't do that here, because I think sometimes people can miss out if they're just so blinkered and so narrow-minded and so controlled in the way they're encouraged to think, behave, do, etc.
I think that the notion there of cult and culture as in its kind of purest form, its almost literal form, is it being very fixed and dogmatic. Whereas the examples of great culture that I've seen and that many of us would kind of, almost automatically reference are often something that has evolved, and it is almost a living, breathing, organic, evolving community experience and dictating what's kind of happening within the business. And maybe that's exactly the danger, is when you slip into dogma and you move away from that communicative experience that allows people to speak up, to innovate, to have freedom of thought, to unique, to be individuals. And you referenced a few leaders there, and some of them you could probably identify as kind of having almost a cult behind that leader. There are a lot of leaders that are truly excellent that are never celebrated because they are maybe perceived as more passive or less driven, because the focus is not in the performance, is what you said at the very beginning when you were talking about leadership, but is in the way of leading. That kind of sparks in me, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I think it's absolutely the case that some leaders who are seen as the pinnacle of the behaviors, of the values, epitomizing the culture they work in, who are trusted to inspire and to deliver and to lead by the very definition of them, are often the problem, are the source of the toxicity. How can leaders, kind of check in to make sure, how do you know that you are not the toxic leader? What can we do? And we explore this in another few of the episodes. Often at the higher levels of leadership, there is much less feedback offered because there's fewer people who can give you that feedback just in numbers, but there are fewer people who are willing to because of the potential impact on their fitting in and their ability to get ahead. You're not going to tell your CEO what you truly think of him or her in that scenario. So how can people just check in with themselves to see how they're approaching their leadership?
Sure. I think it's really important, and self-management is one of my kind of subgroups in my leadership A list. Under that, I've got the headings of autonomy and accountability. I think both of those, and just quickly, the antithesis, just to mention, for autonomy is micromanagement as a leader.
Everyone's friend.
And for accountability, I'd say the antithesis is blame and shame. How does a leader do that? I think for me, the most critical thing is the accountability. So any leader who doesn't have an accountability network, which could just literally be 2 or 3 trusted colleagues who they explicitly have given permission to say, hey, if you ever see me behaving out of line, you have my permission to come and chat to me. And that takes real vulnerability. It takes courage. But to me, that's absolutely the sign of great leadership, those that do that. I think if you've got that level of self-awareness, to have that and to set that up, I think you're going to be doing fine. The challenge is, some of the most toxic leaders are the ones that are the untouchables in some respect, and so how does one go about that in terms of either managing upwards, managing sideways, or managing people who you're leading sometimes, they're out of touch with who they are. And the challenge in that, again, it's always coming back to behaviors and the how, not the what. And I actually coach this quite a bit because a lot of my clients are independent business owners. And they're often saying, oh, I've got this problem person and how do I deal with it? And I'll always say to them, never just tell them what the problem is. It's all about, I use the word curiosity, get curious. And also then potentially, if they're doing something very specific that's a problem, and again, this is a formula, I think I got it from Brené Brown again, but it's the whole focusing on when they do something that you find toxic, rather than saying what you did is toxic, what you do is you say, when you did this, it made me feel that. Because they can't deny, unless they're calling you a liar, they can't deny how it made you feel. If you felt upset, if you felt angry, if you felt embarrassed, if you felt guilty, whatever it is. And then it's a question of how do they respond to that? Whereas if you just tell someone, oh, what you did was wrong, they'll just blow that off quite easily. And very, very rarely will they take note of that. But if there's some minimum form of relationship actually going on there, I think if you can say to them, when you did this, and it's best to be specific rather than generic. I think it's always good to have a specific example in mind. You can just say, that's how you made me feel. And actually, I'd love to chat to you about that. And was that your intention? Or, is there something we could explore? And it starts to open up this conversation again, where you can have that healthy confrontation that we talked about already that says, let's chat about it. Let's not be binary. I'm right, you're wrong. Let's enter into some dialogue and just unpack that together. And usually that will lead to some sort of discovery on both sides. Always go into it open-minded. Never do it over text or email. Always do those sorts of conversations face-to-face with the person, because you can read body language, you can read their eyes. There's so much you can't read if you just do it with text. And I've tried it before. And again, I've learned so much from my own failures. Just trying to do those sorts of things over text or email is always a disaster because they're always misinterpreted or misunderstood. So just getting together with the individual and just having that conversation, it takes a lot of courage. It does take courage, absolutely. But again, those are the people that, like I say, I believe everyone's a leader, right? So in that moment, even if you're going to your boss, you're being a leader by setting an example and opening up a conversation. And some people will be like, oh my goodness, I absolutely didn't mean to do that, or that was not my intention, and I'm so sorry, and let's discuss how we can do that better in the past. Of course, the really toxic ones will probably just not listen or just ignore you or move on. But as you do that, then you build a picture and it becomes more obvious. And And there'll be steps you can take then sometimes to say, oh, maybe that person's not right in this team and maybe they need to move on.
So curiosity, feedback, inviting dialogue. One other thing I'd like to bring into the discussion here is things like employee surveys and different metrics. It does mystify me when the data is there, either in a sharp drop in motivation and satisfaction or in context, when there are figures or dialogue, the context being offered by employees that something isn't right. And particularly for the many companies, typically larger ones, who are running these results or these surveys either annually or at a greater frequency than that, when you do see a significant change, it does make me wonder why those are not investigated, that there is complacency in them. And of course, that does weaken the connection and the trust that the employees who are giving the feedback have when that feedback is ignored. But surely that is a sign as well. Should organizations or someone who is a third party, for example, a coach or a board member, intervene in those situations?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think sometimes, particularly in the more toxic environment, the leadership that initiated or set up the survey feels that simply executing the survey fulfilled their requirements.
Absolutely.
And therefore, oh, look, we did a survey. Yeah, great. Look at what we learned. But then there's that massive gap between, okay, so if you discovered some information, if you got the data, what do you then do with the data? Right? Absolutely. And so, yes, it is confounding that sometimes they will spend the money on doing the research and get the data and then not act on it, for sure. And I think then it's a case of, okay, you have to, again, get curious about why did you do the survey? If you're not going to act on it, who authorized the survey? What can we do about why it's not being acted upon, etc.? And I think, yeah, sometimes that might be outside parties that need to come in and do that. I would say I'd put some onus on the contracting. As a coach, we're big into contracting with our clients. And I think that should be contracted into the survey as well, almost. We don't just look at the results, but actually when the results show certain things need addressing, we can then facilitate and contract the next steps. That might be a different organization that provides that service. But I think when people are kind of getting sign off, so if it's an HR person going to a CEO saying, I need a sign off on this, I would encourage those in HR to say, well, let's not just get the sign off for the survey to be done. Let's contract into that we've also got a commitment that if certain things are highlighted, there will be action. Then you can use third parties or internal trainers and resources, etc., coaches to address what's going on. But otherwise, it is just it's one of those exercises just to put in the annual report. Oh, yeah, we did this employee satisfaction survey or whatever it was.
And conversely, that's also a good moment to celebrate the successes and the development from one point.
Absolutely.
Certainly I have been a participant and the subject of many leadership surveys over my, more than 25 years working in the corporate world. And sometimes there were very hard truths there. And I hope I addressed them and took them on board. I know that there were situations that I didn't. And those then become the harder lessons, the ones that you didn't pay attention to when you're better able to address them. But that kind of correction is also then a point of celebration when a team or a leader or a business turns something around. That goes a very long way to building trust, to demonstrating growth, to improving resilience. And you mentioned the role of third parties and coaches. And I'm curious as to what role you see for coaches in helping individuals who are in a situation where they are suffering or impacted by toxic behavior or low psychological safety. Can we help?
Oh, I absolutely believe we can. Yes, for sure. And I think depending on what state they're in, sometimes you're literally firefighting. You're helping them deal with the stress. You're helping them deal with burnout. You're helping them deal with their anxiety, etc., and how they just behave and show up. But I think on a much deeper level, we can also help them discover, well, maybe I'm just in the wrong place. Maybe I'm in the wrong team. I might be in the right company, but I might be in the wrong team. And it's great that if you're in a larger organization, maybe you can just get a lateral move. But I think sometimes you just discover, again, without thinking about it, you've just kind of drifted into this particular scenario because it's providing a salary and it's a 9 to 5 and you've got a certain level of comfort there. And I think to maybe then as a coach facilitate some challenge to them around, again, I'd always bring it back to values. That's my core. It's what are your values here? What are your personal values? If like for me, contentment is one of my core values. If I'm not feeling content in a situation, I'm going to be curious about, okay, what is it about this situation where I'm sensing this lack of contentment? Is it the work that I'm doing? Is it the boss that I have? Is it the colleagues I have? Is it the ethos of the company? Is it because my commute is too long? There could be 20 reasons why. And usually it's not just one reason. Often there's one reason that takes you over the tipping point, but usually there's a kind of perfect storm of maybe 3, 4, 5 factors that all of a sudden you just add one more thing into that equation and it becomes intolerable. And I think as coaches, therefore, we are the outside set of eyes. We can look in and we can use our tool bag of skills to work with the client to help them come to their own conclusions and get those light bulb moments for them that says, okay, maybe. And sometimes it's not a massive change. I'm not advocating everyone just, who gets really, really fed up and has a toxic boss simply just leaves. Yes, there was the great redundancy or the great resignation, it was called, wasn't it? Was it 21? And yes, I think the global pandemic was really positive for people to reassess their core values. I think that was the one great positive thing that came out. And that's in many instances, as far as what I've read, was a lot of reason why a lot of people suddenly thought, I'm in the wrong job. Why am I doing this? Off I go. I'm going to go and pursue. Because I think research says most people, the job they've done for years is usually their second choice job. And actually what they're passionate about, they never often felt they could actually make a living. So it just ended up being a side hustle or a hobby or a latent desire. And all of a sudden they realize, no, I'm going to just go and do what I really want to do. And so I think it could be that, or it could simply be saying, actually, do you know what? Because of my childcare situation, it would really help if I worked 10 till 6 instead of 9 till 5. And all of a sudden that fixes it. So it could be little adjustments or it could be, major existential moments for people. But I think that the role of the coach there is to really help the client unpack that, come to their own conclusions, see what they need to see, and then help them and guide them through that then decision journey that they need to embark on.
That absolutely resonates with me. I do a lot of work with people who are in a toxic environment or are suffering as a result of bad behavior. And indeed with some who are wondering if they are driving kind of bad behaviors as well. And I have also worked with coach when I was in the corporate world, in these spaces too. And I think it's important to state that there is a consequence to bad behavior, whatever we want to call it, toxicity and psychological safety and the lack of it at work that can become truly traumatic. And coaching can help. And, I've worked a lot of successful interventions. But for some people, something even more is needed because the level of aggression or uncertainty or stress that they are under can be so profound. And it's one of those things that we maybe don't always talk about. But when work is ever present for most of us these days, no matter what role we're in, what level, what industry, and with so many demands on our time and blurring of lines, that is really important to kind of acknowledge that sometimes things can be so bad that you really need to step back and kind of get some help. But I don't want to end on the kind of trickier notes because certainly we can all see the correlation between toxicity and aggression and stress on well-being. But there's also, of course, the glimmer of hope that is built in all of us with good resilience. How important is resilience in the workplace, and can coaching help to build that in people, to help them recover and relate and adjust when things are hard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, resilience is key for sure. One of the things while you were just talking there, Simone, as well, that I was just going to throw in is the balance of, I know we're talking a lot of corporate stuff, but some of the people listening here might be business founders, entrepreneurs, startups, etc. And I think tying that into resilience, they have incredible resilience usually, which is linked to their motivation because they're the ideas person, they're the person driving, they're the person pushing forward. They do crazy hours, but it becomes their life because that's their idea, that's their thing. And I think one of the biggest challenges is then as they build teams around them, I've heard various people talk about this on podcasts and stuff, is the expectation for people who work for them to have that same level of engagement and enthusiasm, etc. And actually they won't. We shouldn't expect that. But for those of us, in terms of people who are not at the top of the tree and who need to do a job and need that resilience, I think for me, one of the key things that coaches can help with is helping people connect outside of their work, because we can become over-focused on work and the work environment. A lot of people use the term work-life balance, and I kind of rail against that phrase myself. And I like to call it life balance, because for me, work is part of life, just like family time is part of life, just like exercise. And I never think about exercise life balance or family life balance. All of those other things get lumped into life. And for me, actually, work is just as much a part of my life. I don't overemphasize it. I love the work I do, but it's all part of that holistic big life that I have, that I'm very grateful to have been given this chance to exist in the world. So for me, I think it's usually people just who are really struggling with resilience. And as coaches, I think it's amazing to help people kind of connect outside, maybe, well, in various dimensions. I know actually the Association for Coaching just done a series that Rob's hosted on outdoor coaching. And, I do a lot of my coaching as I walk. I love walking, and it's just getting out, connecting with nature and the sky, the trees, the mountains, etc. But what's your hobby? What's your connection to other things? And I think coming back to my point earlier about a problem usually has multiple strands to it. Okay. You used the analogy of a tapestry earlier, right? In our chat, there's multiple strands. And I think as coaches, when we look at the resilience of someone, I think what's helpful to do is to unpack what are the key elements that are causing the challenge around resilience. Because actually, what you might need to address is not your job. We obviously look at work's causing me stress, etc. But how are you sleeping? How's your nutrition? Are you exercising? Are you connecting with people? There's so many other factors. And I think, again, that's where coaching has a real role in helping people holistically understand, yes, there might be some stuff that we can help them with specifically within their business relationships with its colleagues or people who work for them or people they work for. But to me, I think it's in terms of that resilience, for me, what makes people most resilient is life balance and getting all of those things addressed, not just saying, oh, that's the problem. We put a sticky plaster on it or whatever, and we think it's going to fix it. But usually it doesn't last that long and the problem re-arises. So I think it's looking at all of the factors that can potentially influence and help people be at their best and most resilient in their work situation.
Fantastic. And we have a great episode looking at the importance of well-being in being an effective and kind of human-centric leader too. So I think that kind of connects really nicely with what you're saying. What's one pearl of wisdom you would offer to a leader to help them embrace the human-centric side and say goodbye to toxic, bad behavior?
I think it's something I've already said. If I'm perfectly honest, I think it's the accountability network. It's that being brave enough and vulnerable enough to actually say to some other people, hey, I'm only human. I'm going to mess up sometimes. And sometimes I'm going to be I might be going down a particular path that is not going to be so healthy for me. And I need outside people just to kind of observe me, watch me, and I give them permission to say, call me to account as and when I need to. And I think for me, it's a brave thing to do, but I think it's so essential. And it is that human element. You're bringing other humans into your journey, be that part of your work or outside of.
Fantastic. So that actual curiosity and mindful cultivation of self-awareness, getting feedback and being accountable to your behaviors.
For me, I love the word intentional or intentionality. And it's being intentional about those things. Don't assume they'll happen. Be intentional, get it done, make those things happen for yourself.
And finally, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people get in touch with you to find out more about your work or to connect?
Thanks, Simone. So 2 places I'd point you to. One is very simply my own website, petergreedy.com. You'll get access to me there. But also within work circles, I use LinkedIn. And again, if you just type in Peter Greedy, you will find me there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your energy and your openness in sharing your experience as we explored this dark side of leadership. It was delightful speaking to you today, Peter.
Thanks, Simone. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts like this one, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.